Mark, boy, am I glad you're available to do this job. The client is the Vegas Tourism Board, and they're doing a campaign to try and draw more people out to Sin City on vacation. They didn't have a huge budget for this, so they used stock footage and stock photography to put the spots together. I'm providing the media and the project from the editor who did a valiant job trying to get the idea across, which is normal people in cruddy situations daydreaming about being in Vegas. Feel free to tweak placement and sizing of elements to make this thing work the best it can. I know you'll make it work. Thanks.
At the beginning of the job, I think it's always wonderful to say to the client, this looks like a lot of fun. Or sometimes maybe it comes out more like, this looks like a lot of fun. But in this case, this actually looks like a lot of fun. Let's get into it.
I am in Adobe Premiere Pro, and I'm going to play you the cut that we have from our client and then talk through it a little bit with you in this application.
We know, you'd rather be in Vegas.
All right, this is a really fun idea, and it consists of, as we can see on this Premiere timeline, 3 different shots that have multiple elements in them. Now, if you haven't used Premiere Pro, I would still think you'd probably recognize what it looks like to have layers in an Adobe timeline, similar to After Effects. So these first couple shots are just plain footage, the shot and the reverse shot. And then here, by turning layers on and off, I can see that we've added a screen and there's some chips over here. And then skipping ahead, there are more chips. And instead of a screen, we now have a couple of slot machines as her fantasy really takes hold. And then of course we have the ending shot where she has now been transported to a casino.
So right off the bat, my impression of this is a spot that relies entirely on visual effects. That's not to say that the effects are crazy elaborate, but this is magical realism. So the audience is gonna watch this and they're gonna know this stuff's not really happening. She's either dreaming it or she's so good at manifesting reality that she's creating her own. But either way, it's gonna work because what we do is both believable in that it looks right and kind of not because it's preposterous.
So right when I started watching, when we go from this first shot to the second one, there's something a little jarring to me, and you might have noticed it too. I don't know where she is. It seems like from the cut that she must be in the scene, and at first I thought maybe this other dark-haired woman was her, but of course it can't be because they don't really look anything alike, and they're not dressed alike if you look closely. So apparently she's probably sitting right where our point of view is here. Now there's a problem with that. I don't know if you can see right away what it is, but we're basically looking across the tops of heads here, especially here. We're at a pretty high angle, and you can tell by how the table slopes down that the camera that caught this shot was actually probably just above the level of their heads. And so it doesn't really match what would be her point of view, even if right now she had turned her head. And that's another thing. She's not looking straight ahead in this shot. She's actually looking off to the side. When you notice things like this in a cut, there are things on the After Effects side that you can do about them. But you want to know your client. And you want to know whether they're going to be open to you doing that or whether they even need it. They may have their own plan for how this cut is going to work. What we do know is that the assignment is to composite these 3 shots and make them look more realistic. And that's where we're going to focus most of our effort.
Before you start a project like this and just dive into it, there are a few things that's really helpful to know. And you may just know them or you may need to ask. So first thing, I'm watching this cut and I can see there's some things I'm probably gonna wanna change even with the timing and the framing of the shot. This feels pretty loose and like this kind of client is gonna be happy to let me do that, but certain clients would really hate that. So I'm a big believer in the saying that goes, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, but when you ask for permission, you don't waste a lot of time doing stuff that they just end up saying no to. So just kind of feel that one out or just flat out ask. Similarly, you really do need to know what you're delivering. It's going to make a big difference if we deliver this in 4K or 2K. And so if that's not clear, you want to know, are you delivering individual shots or the whole cut? And are they asking you to do any color correction or any other finishing on it? That's not a big deal here, but that's, again, something you could offer, you could do in a really simple way, or you could spend quite a bit of time. And if you spend quite a bit of time, it's probably a line item in your budget. Finally, there's a question within your studio. Do you want to work on everything within a single project, which is how I'm going to work on it because it's just me? Or do you want to divide it up so that each shot is a different project, or similar shots are one project, and then the reverse shot or the alternate shot is a different one? That can help when you have multiple artists working on it, because obviously if everything's in one project, it's much harder generally to share it up. I know they're like team projects and things, but I'm not a big believer. So that's a lot I just threw out there, but those are all things that I would think about before you just dive in and start working.
If you haven't done this before, it's pretty straightforward on the one hand and can also get a little confusing on the other hand. So let me show you the simple part, which is just getting started. Under File, Import, I can choose Import Adobe Premiere Pro Project, and there it is. Now, there's only one sequence, so it doesn't really matter if I just say all sequences. And the way things come in, it's organized exactly as it was in Premiere, which we didn't really look at, but there are a lot of individual folders, sometimes called bins in editing. And then there's the master sequence, which I'm just going to drag out to the root, and I'll close that up. So already this isn't exactly how I would organize this in After Effects, but I'm not going to worry about that too much and just move on with this composition. As soon as I open it, one look at the timeline and it looks like kind of a mess. It's really different than how it looked in Premiere Pro. And this might even dissuade you a little bit from starting out this way. But let's break this down a little bit, particularly if you're just not familiar with the difference between the two apps. So Premiere Pro is an editing application. Let's just take a quick look back in Premiere Pro at the same project. The way things are organized here, we have tracks with a number of shots in each track. So at the base level, in that V1 track, are all the source video backgrounds, and then above them are the layers that were added. But for example, where there's this loop of the slot machines blinking, that's the same cut repeated multiple times in the same track. And down here below, of course, are the audio tracks. Over in After Effects, those loops of the slot machines are now each an individual layer. So in editorial, we want things to be organized so we can have multiple clips on one track, but that makes it difficult to work with them as individual layers. After Effects, on the other hand, is set up to allow us to freely reorganize and animate individual layers as elements. And that's what we like about it. But that means that we've got a bit of cleanup to do if we want this to not just be kind of an unholy mess over here in After Effects. So the first thing I'm going to do is just sequester, if you will, all the audio into a pre-comp. And if sequester is not, if that's too fancy a word, I'm just going to pre-comp it. So with all of the audio layers selected, I'll just pre-comp those. And I can give that a helpful name, something really simple like audio all. And the thing to keep in mind in this case is I don't need to worry about audio at all in After Effects. It's just a reference. So I'm just going to move everything into that one comp, and I'm going to turn it off because actually I don't really need it as I'm previewing. It can get annoying to have an audio playing every time you preview. I'll just turn off the visual as well, even though there isn't any. And that'll just remind me that that layer is really not participating in the work that I'm doing. And if I really don't want to worry about it, I could even lock it, but let's move on. So here are those base background layers. And then the way things are right now, each track sequentially is above the next one. So what I would like is for each shot to be organized so all those layers are together. And I'll probably end up pre-comping them later, but for now, let's just at least organize it a little better. Using Command or Control on Windows, left square bracket, I can move the layers down, which also pushes them all together. Command right bracket to move them up one. Then moving to the next section, again, these are the loops of the pinball machine, and they're looped like that so that the blinking happens in this kind of incessant repeating fashion. Now, there's something that appears to be a little bit off here. Let me zoom into the timeline, and you can see there's an extra frame at the beginning. And actually, if we go to the other end, there's also a gap at this end of a frame. Now, normally I would drop everything at this point and figure out what the heck happened, but because I already know what happened, I'm gonna move on and save this fix for just a few minutes from now in this lesson, because right now I just wanna focus on the job at hand, which is getting this a little organized. So let's just do a quick fix. I'll select all these layers that are off, deselect the one that's not, just nudge them forward one frame. And now what I'd like to do is take care of this loop, because it's bugging me that it was done in this way that creates a lot of layers. I would like those to be one layer. Now, I could do that by pre-comping all of them into one layer, and that would be done. But there's a more elegant way to do it. So let's do that, and it'll allow me to show you a pretty nifty little expression that is actually probably the one I use the most doing visual effects in After Effects, and that is keyframe looping. So with the first layer selected, I'm going to add time remapping, and that creates keyframes at the beginning and end of the original clip. I just have to go to the in point and create a keyframe there, another one on the out point, and then get rid of the other two keyframes that I don't need. And now I have the basis to loop those. Now, to loop these, I'm gonna assume that you've never really worked with expressions. If you have, you probably know this trick already. You can activate an expression for any property by Option or Alt clicking on the stopwatch. And that gives you a little bit of code. And right now it's just the default, so nothing has changed yet. By selecting that one little bit of code, what I can do is choose a different command here. And I could also just type this in, but I'm going to show you how to find it on this menu. So under property, there are a number of expressions that start with loop. And the one that I'm looking for in this case is loop out. That's the one you're going to use the most often. And this is the type of situation where you would use it. And there's some other stuff in here. Those are the arguments. I'll get to that in a moment. So having selected it that way, it gave me these defaults. And those are actually exactly what I want. So the type I want is to cycle the number of keyframes I want at the default of 0. I click enter on the numeric keypad, and that expression is committed. Now in the graph editor, I'll show you the result of that. Let's go ahead and stretch this out to the end here. Okay, so there's one cycle of time remapping, and all this is doing is just going through frames in time. So now if I click on this little icon right here, which enables expressions to be previewed in the graph editor, now I can see from this sawtooth pattern that that cycle is happening, that the loop out cycle is repeating. So if I go ahead and actually delete these other layers, then just like that, we've got it cycling, and that is the purple one. So now let's go ahead and do the same on the blue one. I'll just select that layer, go back here to the end, set the out point there, but I can't do that until I set time remapping. With time remapping on, I can lengthen that layer using Option right bracket. I actually made it one frame too long, and I'm kind of a neat freak, so I'm gonna make that right. Go back here. There would have been a faster way to do this, which would be to just copy these keyframes and paste them in. Let's do that now and then delete the other two. That was a little clumsy, but I'm just gonna leave it. And again, I can just delete these other layers. And now it's tidier, which was the whole goal. There are other cases where there are other really practical reasons to use that looping expression. Let's take these, and this time I'm just selecting the top 4, command left bracket to move them down layer by layer until they're above the background. And finally, these last 2 layers, I'm just gonna physically drag them down in the timeline. So now we have a much tidier looking edit. It's still not as concise as it would be in Premiere Pro, but again, for good reason, because now we want to work with these individual layers.
Now let's talk about the dirtiest four-letter word in After Effects, which is precomposing. 2, 3. Precomposing is something that many, if not most, After Effects artists avoid because things go away and you don't have access to them anymore. And in motion graphics, that can be a big problem. If they have keyframes on them, they end up wanting to tweak and adjust. You don't really want to dig down into another comp where you can't see the master comp. You know the deal. In visual effects, however, that's less often the case. Timing comes into play, sometimes a lot, but sometimes not very much. And each element tends to get more work done to it, and then it tends to be done. So, for example, if you're rotoing or keying something out, and it takes a few different layers to do it, once it's done, you can just consider the whole thing a single layer by precomposing it. Now, why do that? Well, if your comp does turn into 30, 40 layers, you're scrolling up and down and you're probably wasting a lot of time looking for stuff. Whereas if you just name things well and keep it minimal in terms of layers, keep it down to, as a rule of thumb, maybe 12 to 15 layers, you're gonna have an easier time. And if anybody else who especially knows visual effects opens up your project and looks at it or tries to work with it, they're gonna be so glad that you did it that way, that you named your layers in an intuitive way and that things are kind of packaged up. So it's probably not intuitive. It may not even sound good to you if you're more from motion graphics, but just keep it in mind and see if it makes sense to you as you work along.
Okay, so now we're gonna pre-comp one of these shots and get to work on it. And the question is, which one? Now, some people would say you should start with the hardest shot, get that out of the way, and it's all downhill from there. Me, I'm a little bit the opposite sometimes, and I like to start with the easiest shot, and that is clearly gonna be this one. Now, maybe you didn't expect that, but to make this the easiest shot requires the use of one of the most hidden secret weapons in After Effects. So let's go ahead and pre-comp this and get ready to work. Select those 3 layers, pre-comp them. I'm just gonna call it Casino to keep it simple. And then once it's open, let's organize things a little bit. The top layer is the logo, so I'm gonna just gray that out and lock it because you never touch the logo. And I'm also gonna gray out and lock the background because we're not really doing anything with that either. And that leaves this layer, which has just a crude mask on it, which I'm going to remove. So what we're looking at here is our foreground character over a background with a lot of similarly colored detail, especially around the hair. Her shirt has pretty nice contrast. And if we look at this in the color channels, which I'll do with shortcuts, you can see that particularly in the blue channel, we could do a pretty nice key for that shirt. But the hair, boy, I don't know. Not to mention that there's a lot of fine detail in this hair. I mean, look at all those little wispy hairs. So are we gonna just have to draw a mask right around that hair to get that? Well, the 2-word answer to that question is hell no. And the 1-word answer for how we're gonna solve this shot is, ready for it? Roto brush. That's right, roto brush, I'm not kidding. The weird thing about roto brush, and you're probably gonna hear me say this again, is it's not good at roto. It's really good at 2 things. One is selecting things that you almost could just do with luminance, really obvious edges. But the other is the opposite. It's fine detail, like hair or leaves of trees, that is just a nightmare to roto. Roto brush is up here in the toolbar, and maybe you've tried it before thinking it would solve all your roto problems and found out that you were wrong. But if you've never tried it, when you select it and click right here in the comp, nothing happens. And the reason for that is you actually have to work in the layer view. Now in layer, I have this green cursor, which I can make larger or smaller by holding down the Command or Control key. But right now the size doesn't matter, so I'm fine with it as it is. And I'll just start drawing right on my foreground character here. Now, as soon as I do that, this warning has appeared at the bottom of the frame. And spoiler alert, this is related to earlier when I noticed those layers were offset a frame in time. In fact, if you look carefully down here in the timeline, this layer is again off by 1 frame down here. So the issue, which I'm sure you can't read even if we zoom in here, maybe you can if we zoom in, but it says frame rate mismatch So apparently, the composition needs to be set to 25 frames per second to match the layer source. Well, if you're not technical, you may not have experienced frames per second much or anything to do with it. But as you work with video in After Effects, it's an important thing to actually keep track of, because if you get mismatched frame rates, you often have to actually pretty much throw your shots away. And I've seen it happen at pretty high levels. So don't let that happen to you. Instead, as soon as you see this helpful warning, go and try to solve what has happened. Now, you might think that means, oh no, we got to go back and ask for a new edit. We got to get the footage all converted. Everything's going to have to be started from scratch. No, not at all. Instead, all we're going to do is right click on this layer and reveal it in the project using reveal, layer source and project. Now down here in the lower left of the project panel is the interpret footage dialog. If I click that, it pops that up. All I have to do is type in a new number, and it's even already highlighted for me. So I'm going to say 23.976. Now, never mind for right now why that's 23.976 instead of 24, which is what it actually is. That's because of sound syncing in the United States, and don't even get me started. But anyway, that's what the frame rate should be, 23.976. And as soon as I select that, the error goes away. Well, of course, RotoBrush is still not happy because we started with the effects. We're going to have to start over with that. I'm also going to go ahead and just fix this little syncing thing. Now, things going off by one frame every time I do this is probably not the end of the world, but After Effects is always going to do its best to keep everything synced up. And so that little gap was actually just simply because the frame rate didn't match. So I want to at least make sure I have that lined up at the beginning. Okay, so having done that, I'm now ready to move forward. I'm going to take a look in the effect controls and just delete the RotoBrush effect that was already applied. So we start over again. And now I'm going to just outline this foreground figure. And I'm not too particular about how I do that right now. The pink line describes the selection that has been made by RotoBrush. So one instant problem is there's no pink line on this side of her head. It goes right across the top. I'll hold down the Option key and just add that area. Now notice I was nowhere near the edge. And in fact, you don't necessarily, really don't ever actually want to be. And there's something I already did wrong, which is I started painting right here on the first frame of the video. And the reason that that was the wrong decision is that in this case, looking at the video, she doesn't change her position much. And the most flexible place to put it would be right here somewhere in the middle. So I'm gonna, again, just undo my decision by deleting the effect and try once more. Now, this time I'm also gonna go a little more carefully around the hair right here to get this part, not the wispy part, but just the part that is solid hair that wasn't selected before. And again, I need to subtract this area over here. And now I'm also free to touch up a little bit on this base frame. So this blue marker here is the base frame, and that's where we are. And you want to make as many changes as you can, if not all, to that base frame. I'll explain more as we go. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of the hair. And again, I'm avoiding where it becomes seriously wispy and translucent. But this right here looks really good to me. If we take a peek at the result back in the comp, it's not looking too hot. In fact, it looks terrible. And this is what you probably associate RotoBrush looking like if you've used it without actually going the level deeper that we're going to go. Okay, so let's go a level deeper. Having made the base outline on this frame, still on this frame, I'm going to add a refined edge using the Refine Edge tool. Now for this, again, the size of my brush matters a bit, but I want it to be large enough that I can basically trace down the edge and get all this wispy. So that looks about right. So I'm going to do just that. I'll go right down here through all the areas that have little wispy hairs down to her shoulder. And you see now the X-ray view. And if we zoom in on it, Looks like we've got quite a bit of detail happening now. Let's try the same on the other side before we take a peek at the result. And back in the comp. Now, like a miracle, it looks like RotoBrush has added in an amazing amount of detail. Let me just solo the layer for a moment. You can see it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn great, at least on this one frame. There's a lot of subtlety to all of those fine hairs on the edge that otherwise I pretty much wouldn't have been able to get with this amount of detail. Now again, right now we're just looking at the base frame, that blue frame there that we've done all our work on. And RotoBrush is going to automatically extend this to what's called the span. It's really hard to see, but the span is represented by some almost black little squares. They're very dark gray. You have to look really closely for them. And you see this double-ended arrow, which is going to let me extend the span all the way to the beginning. I'm only able to do this because this particular shot is very static. So I'm pretty confident that what I did on the base frame is going to extend through the whole shot. Now I could start to move around the shot and see how that is, but that's going to take some time. And instead, in this case, what I'm going to do is actually freeze the shot. As soon as I click freeze, this is a slightly unusual way to do this, but it's going to allow us to move a little faster. When I click freeze, it's going to render the RotoBrush for all those frames so we can evaluate the whole shot at once. So you notice what it's doing is creating a green line preview, first going backwards from the base frame, and then after that going forwards. And once the RotoBrush selection is frozen, it's not going to have to do this rendering over and over again every time you go to a frame. So as soon as you get a good base frame, and particularly if you've also checked out the whole span and it's looking good, this is something you want to do. Normally, we would have spent a little more time refining it, but I want to look at the whole shot all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. You can also undo it once you've done it. All right, time to check out the result. I'll unsolo the layer back here in the comp and just preview it. And again, I seem to have had this one little gap open up here. There we go. Now we need to work with just the shimmer that's appearing in the detail over here on the right and left, and just maybe soften some of these edges a little bit. One important note here has to do with resolution and this pull down right here. So right now I have it set to quarter res, and in motion graphics land, you could practically complete a project working all at quarter if it's all about motion. You don't often need to see things at full res, but obviously here I'm looking at fine detail and I'm even zooming in. And if I knock that down to even half resolution, I'm no longer seeing an accurate representation of what my edges look like. So these lower resolutions are great for looking at animation, but they're terrible for looking at detail. So be aware of what zoom level you're at. And if you're at 100 or above and you're looking at detail, make sure that your quality is at full. If you want a foolproof way to control that, you can set this to auto. And by doing that, anytime I'm zoomed in, it'll be at full. And if I zoom out, it'll drop down to the corresponding resolution for whatever zoom I'm at. So at 50% I'm at half, 25% I'm quarter. If that's not so useful to you, you can also use keyboard shortcuts. Command J gets you to full, Command Shift J gets you to half, and Command Option Shift J gets you to quarter. And of course, the corresponding ones on Windows use Control and Alt. The RotoBrush and Refine Edge effect includes a number of controls to now adjust the edges. And when I say now, I mean now that we've created a RotoBrush stroke and even frozen it. So I'll solo the layer and just take a closer look at what we've got. There's this kind of dark edge around her shirt. And then as we saw, there was a kind of what I called shimmer, which is actually what you would call chatter in the realm of RotoBrush. So let's just go ahead and adjust both of those. The black line along here is also something we can adjust using decontaminate edge colors. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and do that one first. This often actually is helpful to do. Now, right off the bat, it didn't totally solve that black line along there. What I can do is take a look at the decontamination itself, and the white areas are where decontamination is helping. So if I increase it to maybe like 2.5, now that line is thick enough to incorporate the area where that black outline was happening, and now it's gone. Now, this isn't always the right choice because it does kind of bleed colors together in a way that isn't always what you want, but in this case, it looks like that is helpful. The feather controls in RotoBrush are a little different than feather in any other After Effects tool. They're kind of weaker. So right now there's a feather by default of 5 on all the edges where you're mostly going to see along the shoulder there. And that still looks kind of hard to me. So I'm going to double that to 10. And it just looks just a little bit softer like that. Down below the main RotoBrush matte tools, which are those hard edges like the shoulder, are the refine edge matte tools. And so that's going to be up here for the hair. So I'm also going to add just a bit of feather to that. And you can see that just kind of nicely soften things. But if I preview, there's still going to be that chatter happening. We can even see it frame by frame as I preview. It's pretty pronounced. For that, I'm going to turn on chatter reduction. There are a couple options, more detailed or smoother. Now, in this case, I don't really care about having more hair detail as such, but I do want it to be smoother. And so I'm willing to have the slower method in order to make it smoother. And I'm just going to go a couple frames ahead and behind. It is slower now. And there is less chatter, but there's still a bit. So one thing you can do is raise the reduce chatter amount. And in fact, you can go above 100%. So in this case, I'm going to go all the way up to 200%. Now, I came to that number via a bit of trial and error, but I'm just now showing you that that's going to calm things down. And so let's go ahead and preview that. Now here's an irony for you. With Roto, whether it's RotoBrush or masks or whatever method you're using, you work frame by frame, but you can't really see what's going on until you look at it in full motion. And having done that, we're really close, but I'd still like to see it quieter around these edges of the hair. So what to do? You might be inclined to go into these matte and refine edge matte settings and mess around with those. But before I do that, I want to take a look again at my RotoBrush work on this layer. Now, to properly see it, I'm going to have to turn on this pink alpha boundary again. And when I do that, I'll bring this up full screen so you can see it as well. There are areas in the hair, just zoom in, that are showing as selected semi-opaque, but if I turn off the render, they're actually pretty solid. They should be. And it would be so great to just firm those up. So, by the way, the pink boundary lines only show up with the RotoBrush tool, and you can activate them, this little button down here. There's even a shortcut, option 5. Down here, you can also use option 6 to just see the masked area with a color, and you can even set what color you want. And down here, of course, there's the equivalent of option 4, the alpha channel. And you might be thinking, well, if only I hadn't already refined the edge, now I'm stuck, right? Well, in fact, no, you're not. I'm going to just turn off freeze and go back to the base frame. And the reason, again, that I go back to the base frame all the time is that's the only frame that I can adjust that affects the whole span. Any other frame is only going to affect all the frames that either follow it or come before it away from that base frame. So I hope that made sense. Now, what I want to do is just take the RotoBrush tool, the original one, not the Refine Edge tool, and come down much closer to the edge this time and just reselect through here. Let's see if that worked. Yeah, so looks like maybe I went a little too far right there. Let's try once more. You do have to be a little careful how you do this. I don't want to play a game of going back and forth over and over again. You know what I mean? Okay. And then over on this side, do the same thing, just through the areas that I know are opaque. So there's a much narrower edge that is being refined now. I see a little issue right there, and it's also okay to just go back with the refine edge tool and make sure that that one is looking semi-opaque. Okay. So normally I don't freeze the roto brush every time I adjust it, but as I get close to the end, I just go ahead and bite the bullet. This takes a little while. We're going to speed it up in the recording, but it will save me time again every time that I go back through this cut. Otherwise, it's going to have to re-render all of these strokes every time, and you really don't want that. Having done that, we'll take a look at the original edit. Before I ran preview it, I wanted to point out that the roto brush strokes have been exposed here in the timeline, and they have little eyeballs on each stroke. So if you needed to, you could either turn them on and off, or you could even go in and delete the ones that weren't working if you went down a certain path and it wasn't taking you in the right direction, but you didn't want to start over again. I say we call it good and move on to the thing that stands out to me most right now, which is color matching in this shot.
There are two major problems with RotoBrush and two things that is really excellent at. The first major problem with RotoBrush is that it has the word roto in it, which implies that it's good for rotoscoping when it's not. It's great if you have a high contrast type of situation. Take a look at this DKNG print on my wall. It would nicely select that frame and the print inside it. And if I had a moving shot of the wall, it would remove it no problem. Big deal, right? But the big deal is that it would also work really well with hair or other fine detail, a tree line, little blades of grass with a sky behind them, what have you. For whatever reason, RotoBrush is better at that than almost any tool I know of. Those two situations are great. Forget about the rest. The other warning I have about RotoBrush is that it is a processor hog. So as you see me work, you're going to see me waiting for frames to update, even when I'm just looking at the RotoBrush tool in the layer viewer. When you get ready to leave the layer viewer and just work with the result in your timeline, I highly suggest you consider freezing it first. You can go get a cup of coffee because it's going to take a little while to do that. But then you won't have this death by 1,000 cuts of it having to update and redo RotoBrush every time you go to a new frame. And not only that, the way RotoBrush works, it's a cumulative effect. So it's starting wherever you set your first frame and then doing all the frames back to the one where you're at or forward to the one that you're at. And it sometimes will do that over and over again, even if you think it should be buffered. So those are my two major cautions about RotoBrush, and now you can have fun with it.
Now, anytime you have talent standing in the near foreground and a background far behind, you kind of get to do whatever you want with lighting. You could decide that actually she's standing at the edge of this futuristic car exhibit that has a big spotlight on it, and that's why she looks so much more lit up than the rest of the scene. On the other hand, that's a terrible idea. What you really want to do is make her look like she belongs in the scene, at least as a starting point. And we'll talk a little bit later about the leeway you have in that. But right now, she just does not look like she belongs in the scene, and it's no longer because of her edges. There are a couple different tools that I use for color matching, and those are levels and curves. I'm going to start with levels because it's a little easier to show what I'm doing, and then I'll recreate a similar adjustment with curves. Most of you have probably used this effect before, but I'm going to show you how to use it in maybe a slightly different way than you have in the past. The first thing I want you to do is stop looking at this as a color image and instead view it as black and white or grayscale. And the simplest way to do that is to switch to one of the individual color channels. Now, there are shortcuts to go to red, green, and blue. In most cases, including this one, I suggest you start with green. Green is the dominant color in your vision spectrum, and it's going to have the closest to representative grayscale of the whole image in most cases. And therefore, that makes the green channel a good starting point. We could adjust just the green channel, but in fact, I want this as a starting point to adjust the entire image. And I wouldn't necessarily do it this way if, say, the image were predominantly green, or if instead it had almost no green in it. But this is sort of a regular run-of-the-mill set of colors in this image. So to start out, she looks really bright. The immediate fix for that is to bring down her output white, essentially to lower the level and the contrast in the white. Of course, since we're in a low dynamic range image here, that's going to make her look kind of gray. So this is kind of an unusual case where I'm actually going to start with a gamma adjustment. That's this middle slider, as you probably know. And counterintuitively, you move it up to go down in gamma level, or at least in gamma perception. Now, where do you want her to be? I'm going to go for something that pretty well matches the scene to begin with. So there's nothing in the scene that's exactly like her color. I'm just trying to create a black and white image or grayscale image that looks believable. Like if I were going to output this as a black and white photo, I would want it to look right. So let's call that a good starting point. You are free to disagree, and you're going to get your own chance to do this. Now we're going to move over to the red channel. Now here she is clearly too bright. So this time bringing down the white level is probably a good idea. I don't like to mess with gamma in the individual colors. And I just made a mistake, by the way. So one thing I didn't do, I'm just going to undo that, is I didn't switch over to red. That's very important because we started in green, but we adjusted the overall RGB. Now we're going to adjust individual color channels, and that's where the real magic is going to kick in. So again, we're doing the same thing as before. We're adjusting this as if it were a grayscale photo. And again, I just see her looking too bright. And in this case, I don't mind the slight loss of contrast by bringing down this level. So that's the output white level, as it's called. And I'm going to increase the contrast a bit in the blacks by bringing up the input black level. Now again, we're just doing this by feel. What feels good? Something like that might be about right. Okay, so we already adjusted looking at green. Let's go over to blue. Okay, blue's a little weird. So in blue, her shirt, which is more blue than anything else, is just really, really bright. It's like these lights in the background. So I want to bring that down a bit. But that, of course, is making her face, which already looked really dark, look even darker. How shall I deal with that? Well, it could be that, despite that I said don't adjust gamma here, a slight gamma adjustment is called for, but only slight. And again, to repeat, I was suggesting you not adjust gamma in individual color channels using levels. It's a little better doing this in curves. You have a little more latitude to make it work. But that is looking more like a believable grayscale image to me. So let's just call that our first attempt. And now it's time for the voila moment. Turn off the blue channel. And instantly that looks bad, right? But I'm going to show you how we're within range of something good. So I went too far with the blue gamma, as I thought might be the case. And I think I'm just going to bring that back to the middle and take care of the blue channel some other way. I think the blue-white level is also coming down a bit much. It's turning her a little bit green. So we're just going to soften these adjustments to the gamma and input white here. I'm looking right now at the highlights in her hair and just kind of balancing things out. Okay, and then let's look at the red channel because we made a pretty big adjustment over there as well. I'm just going to gently move these around and see if we're in the right place. And now I'm really looking at, do I like the way she looks? Whether or not it looks to you like she's now matched in the scene, let's take a look at a before and after. So We've adjusted her to there, and that's where we started out. So that will do as my example of how to adjust in levels. And now I'm going to start over in curves as if we never did this and see if I can do even a little bit better. So once again, I'm going to go to the green channel. And again, to remind you why, I just want to look at this as a grayscale image. If I were to take the whole image and turn it grayscale, it would look a lot like this green channel in this case, because green's the dominant color again. So let's just come down. There. So I'm just going to work with gamma for now. Move over to red and switch to red over here. That's looking somewhat believable, but I want to see the overall gamma come down a little bit more. And then blue, same problem as before. We need to bring down the shirt, but now our face is going dark. I'm just going to make a middle point to the gamma here. And let's say that that's better and see what we've got. Okay, so it's a similar problem as before. I went too far with blue, turned her shirt green, and I went a bit far, or maybe not far enough with the red. Let's see. And that's subjective, of course. I'm really just trying to balance her colors again. Okay, so again, that's before and after, right? And now the thing you can do here in curves that you can't really do in levels is add another point. And I'm just wondering about her highlights overall. So notice if I add a point in the highlights here, we get a lot of nice control over the detail in her face. And the face is really, of course, what we want to adjust around. Now, to me, that's starting to look pretty nice. I would, at this point, maybe walk away and come back later and see if all of a sudden the shirt still looks too green or something else seems to be wrong like that. But that's the after, that's the before. It now looks to me a lot more like she is believably in this casino. Now, you could argue that the shirt is too bright, and that's fine. In fact, you can see somebody else wearing white over here, and their shirt's not as bright. However, like I said, this is our lead talent here. So it's not so much that I want her to look as if she's blending into this environment, but just that she believably is the star of this environment as opposed to some postage stamp alien stuck on top of it.
The process that we're getting into here is one that I have called in my book of a million years ago, color matching for the color blind. Now, if you look at our girl there, she wasn't really matched there at the end, but maybe because she's in the foreground, she could be in some slightly different lighting, and we want her to pop out. Like I said, she's the star, but she's matched. She's not stuck in there. And the way I'm going about matching her in is not by guessing. Now, this title, Color Matching for the Color Blind, is not a gimmick. There was actually a guy at ILM who was colorblind who would match shots for feature films using this technique. Now, most of us are not exactly what you would call colorblind, but we can get fooled by changes in ambient light conditions, which is why we tend to work in environments that look kind of like this. But the great thing about matching colors on grayscale channels like this is at least twofold. One, your monitor adjustment doesn't matter. You could be using the crappiest, most poorly adjusted monitor in the world, but all you're trying to do is make a grayscale channel look believably like a black and white photo on 3 different channels. The other piece that's so great about this is that your eyes are much more sensitive to variances in light level than slight differences in color. And so even if you're not colorblind, you can get fooled sometimes thinking a color is one thing or another. Again, it's a thing of context, whereas your rods or your cones tend to pick up light levels, black to white, much more acutely. It's a survival mechanism. Seeing contrast in nature helped us get this far. Finally, I want to say when you see me do this work, you're going to see me mostly using levels or curves. You won't see me use brightness and contrast. Levels and curves are similar. Curves has this kind of elegant way of letting you work with gamma and kind of roll it off, whereas levels has this great histogram that can be very useful, and it also gives you numbers that are very precise to work with if you want to actually hand those off or see what they are. Brightness and contrast, on the other hand, doesn't even let you adjust the contrast in the whites versus the blacks. It just works on the overall image. So it's probably the most popular effect for adjusting brightness and contrast, and it's the one that I would encourage you to never, ever use.
Now I want to make her look like she's actually as much in this casino as anything we see in the background. So again, I'll go to the green channel, and this time I'm going to actually evaluate some levels in the foreground and background. And to do that, I have switched my info panel in a very significant way. By default, when I'm working in 16 bits per channel, as I have been, which you can see over here in the project, your pure white, for example, on this logo, is going to be a value of 32,768, which is pretty frustrating and kind of useless to try to work with. What we care about are proportions between these colors, and those are hard to evaluate when you're dealing with values that are in the thousands and that add up to sort of an odd number like that. So digitally, it makes sense why 16 bits adds up to that number, but for artists, it really doesn't. Some people are pretty comfortable with 8 bits per channel. Now, notice here in the hamburger menu, the upper right of the info panel, I can choose 8-bit per channel, and it does not change my project bit depth. All that does is now show me that absolute white is 255, which is something we're all familiar with. What I suggest, however, that you do in this case is to move to decimal color, and that makes absolute black 0 or close to it. I don't know if I have any absolute black in here. And absolute white is 1. And again, this is in low dynamic range, and in HDR, it's a different story, as you know. So this will allow me to look at a given color and pretty quickly assess, like, okay, red 0.43, green 0.25, blue 0.22. There's about twice as much red as green and blue in what I think is a white hoodie over here. And if I go over to her teeth, that's 4 to 3.5 to 2.9. So not quite as distinct a proportion. And it's helpful to move your cursor around a little bit because you'll see the blues and greens trade off. There's not so much distinction between the red versus blue and green here. But the first adjustment I'm going to make to get her into this casino is just to make her less bright. Because right now it's really like she's got a special light on her. And let's just take that off by taking the levels down. Now here, I can look at this white over here in the background and see that those levels are around 0.3 and 0.4. And I can look at her shirt and see that it's still a little bit brighter. And so to really match in, she'd be something like that. And of course, this is subjective. She's in the foreground. She could be lit separately, as we've already established. But this time, we're making her look like she's really just standing in the casino. So now, having done that, let's take a look at the white level on her teeth again. And it looks like there needs to be some more red in the whites. So I'm going to increase the contrast in the whites by pulling down input white. Go a little bit further. 26 to 1916 is much more like the ratio I saw over here. And then let's check out some blacks. So the side of these slot machines, again, has about twice as much red as green or blue. And if I go into the shadows of her hair, there's actually less red. So we're gonna wanna lift the output black to introduce more red in there. Now I'm looking at the green channel at the moment, so we should switch to the red. but we're not doing this visually. We're doing it with that info panel. So red over here is at 0.12. Here it's at 0.7, 0.07. So we could come up quite a bit more. But there's also eye matching. Right now, her blacks look subjectively like they could match some things. The shadows down here are darker. They're in 0.03. So anywhere in here could be about right. Let's just talk about proportions. So the red proportion is actually too high now. It's 0.09 to 2 and 1 for the others. So let's come back. All right, so now the red is about double the green or blue. All right, well, in the blue channel, it's a little hard to tell if we need to adjust anything. So I'm gonna go back to RGB and see what we've got right now. Wow, okay, well, now, even though I don't like the way she looks as well, she does appear much more to be in that scene. And there's a lot of red in this blue shirt, which, while possibly technically correct, isn't really what I want. So I'm just gonna back off that a little bit. It doesn't have a big effect. So overall, this, from a technical color compositing point of view, is a lot more accurate than where we were at. And so now we've introduced ourselves some leeway to either use this or maybe split the difference a little bit. And if you want to split the difference, there's a simple way to do that. With the layer selected in the timeline, E reveals the effects, and I'll twirl down that second levels that we added. And then under that, twirl down compositing options, and I can just adjust the effect opacity. So this is a great example of how subjective color work is. I'm actually now starting to like matching her in more if I just dial it in to where I'm still getting a kind of naturalness. Now, obviously, ultimately, it's going to be up to some fresh eyes on this, i.e. the client or someone else supervising as to whether this is the right direction to go. But it's always great in visual effects if you can really easily dial something in and out, toggle it on and off. I'm really liking that pretty well.
This is a great example of setting up all these rules about the right way to do it, just so you're free to express yourself artistically. I've come up with two very different looks for this foreground character, each of them valid. Now, I mentioned I would kick it to a supervisor to decide. Maybe I'm the supervisor, and really in that case, it's just like, go get a cup of tea or go home for the night and come back in the morning and take a look. And what's your emotional response to it? And anytime you're gauging that, you're dealing with art. So maybe it's funnier if she really blends into the scene, or maybe it's better for the commercial if she really pops and her skin tones look as nice as they can. That's the art of it. And so that is where I actually find this to be really fun work.
Now let's tackle what seems pretty straightforward, which is to get the screen and the chips looking integrated. There's a little more to it than you might think, but I think you're gonna know how we get started at least. I'll pre-comp and call this wide 1. Start anywhere in the shot. Let's see, this middle layer is the screen, and that would make the top layer chips. So the screen just needs to fit, needs to be a little bigger. I'm not gonna worry about cropping it a little bit. Turn it off. And just hit the corners. Like so. Kind of missed with that one. Essentially, we just don't want these to catch the eye. The thing right off the bat that looks a little wrong is the top. There's some curvature here, so a straight line doesn't quite work. I am just going to cheat this up a little bit, because after that, I don't think anybody will be looking very carefully at it. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that'll do. One thing I will add is a little bit of feather. Real world edges don't look like this. We have reference sitting right behind it, and there's some softness there. So let's just add a little bit of that. This goes for almost any edge you're going to find anywhere. A lot of people don't do that. I think it's a good idea. The screen is too saturated for this shot. We want it to pop, but it's a little bit much right now. So let's add a color correction effect. How about vibrance? And instead of desaturating it, I'll just reduce its vibrance a bit. And that's just to make it look more like something you'd actually see on a screen. Okay, that's pretty good. Something about it doesn't quite match. Let's look at the color channels. Red looks fine. Green, okay. In blue, it looks really dark. I'll add a levels effect and just go to blue. Lift those up a little bit. That looks more like it. Okay, we'll call that done. You could always do away with this if it's not what you want. Moving on to the chips. There's a mask there that we don't want. And rather than roto this, let's take a look at it. I'm going to cheat and paste in a mask that I already created. I think you know how to draw a mask like this, but if not, we're going to be getting more into that in a future lesson. And this one just didn't seem all that interesting to me to demonstrate. I think it needs to move down a bit. And the chips look a little big. Something more like that. I'm just going to have them sit out here where they're not actually on top of that piece of paper. And they're pretty prominent. Now, they don't match color-wise, but that's not going to be too difficult to deal with. Levels again. Main thing I'm seeing is just the red level is popping a bit. I don't like bringing that down as much as I would like bringing up the input black. All I'm trying to do is take the pop off of that red a little bit. I'll zoom in here. And what do we see? I see a couple things right off the bat. First of all, these shouldn't be in sharp focus given that everything around them is a bit soft. I think just a plain old Gaussian blur is fine. Let's see what this gets us. I'll hide the masks. It's not really having a lot of effect, is it? So I could either raise it up quite a bit, and we'll finally get there, or I could use something more like a box blur that's going to get there a lot more quickly. But that's basically going to do it. The other thing that I see that's needed here is a reflection. Duplicate the layer and call this one reflections. Move it down one. And as a total cheat, I'm just going to slide it down, take the opacity down, and raise the blurriness even higher. And obviously some of these are bleeding over onto the paper, so let's just fix that. We'll make that a subtract matte. And that should do it.
So after a good deal of noodling around, we've fixed what was wrong. And the question is, are we done? Let's take a look.
Looking back at the original shot without the screen in there, I can see some reflections in that screen as well as a reference. And I think I have an idea how we can get a little bit of that happening right here. Just duplicate the background and that will become my reflections. Just move it to the top. I'm going to take this layer and scale it up a lot and then set its transfer mode to lighten and move it down somewhere like that. Duplicate the screen and move that to the top. Turn off its effects since we don't need them and set a track matte for that screen. Now all I have to do is bring the opacity down to taste. Now, again, it's a question of let's make the screen read well, but let's make it integrated. So here's it without the reflections. Here it is with subtle reflections. Here it is with more pronounced reflections. So I'm gonna go somewhere between, split the difference and call it good. And then let's take a close-up look at this now and talk about grain. So I'm just gonna lift the gamma over here on the shot, just slightly. And when I play, I can see grain happening in the background. And it's not happening on the screen. So let's add some. Noise and grain, add grain. Make sure you set this from preview to final output, otherwise you won't see it. And even without adjusting it, in many cases, that's gonna be a big improvement. Now, the screen is scaled down to, let's see, I think it's about 30%, yep. So technically we'd wanna scale up the grain size. I don't think there's really a need to do that very much looking at this, but we could do it slightly. Really, if you're looking at it with the gamma up in the zoomed in view, you're getting a decent idea of how it's going to look in the final Really, I think I'm going to barely scale that up at all. Yeah, that looks good. So now without gammaing up, if you're paying attention right now, you can see it. But to the untrained observer, it's going to be a question of the element not standing out for some reason. They probably don't even know what it is. The reflection's a little weird. Maybe down a bit. Because I do want those lights. Okay, that'll work. And then the chips are going to need grain as well. Now, these are scaled way down, 3.5%, and they have the reflections with them. So that is going to lead me to pre-comp. I don't need to open it, but now that whole pre-comp is 100% scale. So now all I have to do is apply, add grain again. Set the final output. And once again, I bet you that's going to just do it right there. Reviewing the whole shot as work in progress, I'm liking it. I like how naturally the chips seem to be there. There is something that's bugging me a little bit. Take a look at the fingers. Notice that the reflection is additive over here. So it's actually making the reflection darker here. And it's doing that with the chips as well. But I'm thinking that where there are reflections of the chips, there should not be reflections of the hands, because I think at this angle, those chips would be blocking those hands from being mirrored right now. And now that I've shown you that, it's probably going to bug the heck out of you too. But this is the kind of critique that would come up on, say, a feature film where you're working on a, dozen different takes of a shot. So maybe we'll just move along now.
I'm a big fan of not being constrained by realism, but I believe what sets you free is doing your work to understand the way realism works. And the way to do that is to get reference. Now, it astonishes me in visual effects how seldom even visual effects artists will go just look at the thing they're trying to create. And sometimes it's just right there in the frame. The reflections on the table, they're right there in the frame. That's all I have to look at. But even if not, in this day and age, it's just too easy to go find an example of what you're trying to create. And then you look at it and then you make a decision. Am I going to do exactly that? Or am I going to bend it? And if so, how? But what I love is when you find a little surprise, some gift from nature that you didn't even realize was going to be the way it looks. And it's almost always better than whatever you were going to come up with. Or if it's what you came up with that you like better, it's still probably going to get something out of that reference. Oh God, that's too much lecturing.
The final shot we have to work on has some repeat stuff, like the chips. So let's make quick work of those. I'm going to get rid of these two reference layers of chips. The larger foreground one, I notice, has been placed right behind that glass, which I think is a great idea. I will steal the chips from this shot. And it looks like it's not long enough. So under time, I'll just choose freeze frame, because this is a still. And the motion is coming from the grain, which is actually applied on this layer. So that'll be fine. Duplicate that layer and move that duplicate down here. Let's scale it up a bit. Let's move the anchor point down there and use scale right here. And some like that, I guess. I guess that looks all right. Let's take a look at those reflections. They were, I know, a little bit cropped before, but I think that'll match up more or less with the edge here in a way where I don't really have to go fix that. And then for the glass, duplicate the background, rename it glass, move it up to the top, set it to a lighten mode, mask it out. And to keep it from looking weird, add a levels effect, which is going to make good use of the histogram, because I'll just pull in input black until it's in the areas that actually have level. What I'm doing is getting rid of the sheen from the table and just keeping what the glass is doing here. And I can dial that in here. I could even mess with the gamma if I wanted to dial it in that way. Get it where it's looking good. Okay. And I think my grain is still fine from last time. Let's double check. We did scale up a little bit, but I just don't think that's going to matter. And it looks fine. So one of the fun things about VFX compositing is that what you're looking for your image is often right there in the source image. There was no need to create anything to get reflections from this glass. They're already there. And all I'm doing is basically giving them enough contrast so that all that's showing up on my top layer is those bright highlights, because that's really what I want. And then I'm using a blending mode that selects just them. I think we'll be doing more of that kind of stuff. And that takes us to these slot machines.
So let's say nobody asked me to put the chips behind the glass. Why do it? Well, we all see scenes that we know were fabricated. And if it's cheap and it looks like, oh, they just stuck the thing out there in the open and the camera's locked off, we might not like it as much as if we look at it and go, hey, wait a minute. They would have had to put that behind that glass. Wow, that's pretty cool. And like that, it's probably going on hopefully at the back of the mind. If it's going on front of mind, then the whole thing's probably really boring. But if at some level you're helping someone suspend their disbelief, which they're doing willingly, right? It's like hypnotism. Like you can't hypnotize somebody who's not willing to be, so I've heard. And so willingly, they're gonna go with you more when you give them nice little details like that. And they're little. That was simple. I didn't go to all the trouble to model how a glass distorts what's behind it. So maybe if somebody's super expert about that, they would be unhappy with it. But those people don't come up very often. And the shots where you would need to worry about that don't either. And when they do, then you can go to town on that.
Let's take care of the simpler hand-drawn masks in this scene, which are static. Those are of the foreground with the table and the slot machines. I think it would help to have something to fill in the gap here. Let's see if we can do it with a shape layer. Now, this is a case where I think we can get away with something really dumb and simple with a pretty blah color, because the last thing we want it to do is call attention to itself. I just got the idea to give this slot machine a little dimension because I saw it in the original image and I noticed that there really wasn't much there. And of course, once again, I need to add grain to that. Once again, just using the standard setting. That is going to leave us with his hands and this plant. I think we also need a little bit of feather around that foreground mat. Maybe less than that. Just tighten things up here a little bit. So we do good halos. Okay, so there's a few foreground details to take care of here. The most obvious one are these hands. There's also some detail on the plant. And it's even bugging me that we have a static mask along this guy's arm while he's moving around. A lot of people wouldn't pick that one up. An even subtler thing that I'm not going to deal with is the fact that this slot machine is not quite locked off. If we zoom in, you see it wobbling a little bit. But that's the kind of thing you usually only see if you loop a shot a lot, like we're doing right now. So I'm just hoping we can kind of get away with that one. So let's get set up to take care of these. The background has no effects or anything else on it. I can just duplicate it, bring it to the top. I'll call this one arm, duplicate it again, call this plant, and duplicate it again and call this hands. So for the arm, let's go ahead and use Roto Brush because I think that will work really well on that one. Right over here, I'll just select the Roto Brush tool, go right down the side of the arm here. That looks good. Get rid of this background that we don't want. Carefully just going right through there. Okay, and I didn't even really pay attention to what frame I did that on because he's so static. So I'll just extend the span across the clip. And I think I'm just gonna go ahead and freeze that because it's gonna work. For the plant, you might think Roto Brush would be perfect here as well. It's similar to the situation with that hair where we did so well, where there's a lot of fine detail. Well, let's give it a try. This puts me in mind though to let you know that with Roto Brush, before you commit too far, you do want to just do a little test if you're not sure whether it's going to be the right choice or not. So I'll just take a little bit of the plant here and a little bit over here. And maybe just get all the in-between. Okay, that's fine. And now the rest I'm going to consider fine detail. And just go up here and paint in where I see this kind of detailed stuff over here. A little bit over there. I'm not going to worry so much about that there. We'll just take a little bit here. Now, again, I wasn't very careful about where I selected it, but the plant doesn't change much over the course of this. So let's just go back a few frames. Let me get right in here and see. Well, what do you notice right away? It doesn't seem to be very static. The plant's not moving, and yet that mask, or the selection area rather, is moving quite a bit. And we're fighting an uphill battle here. Let's try something else.
So you may have heard it said that there's more than one way to skin a cat. Most of us haven't actually skinned a cat, so we can't say. Anyway, when you watch me work, keep in mind, my way is not the way. It is a way. And when I've worked on teams of artists who are doing similar stuff, especially when it comes to the small detailed stuff, I've noticed that everybody approaches it a little bit differently, and that's great. And in this course, what I would love is for you to get familiar with the way I'm doing it and why. And in many cases, if you guys come up with something better, more expedient, or just more your own style, awesome. That to me is complete success in this course, and I encourage you to outdo me.
So when you're solving a roto problem, it's super helpful to narrow it down to just what you have to worry about. I've masked out the 2 bits of plant detail that I want to keep here. And so in thinking about how to do this without actually painting in these leaves, because I'm lazy, I'm going to look at the color channels. Now you'd think that green would be a helpful place to look, but look at that, there's no contrast between the leaves and the background. That's not because the background is green, but just because the amount of green to make it gray is about the same amount as to make these leaves green. That means another channel might help us more. Not so much red, but in the blue channel, we find that the lack of blue in this plant is actually what is going to help us get this job done. So this is skipping ahead because this is actually a keying lesson, but it may come in handy. So let's just give this a shot really quick. Under keying, extract, I'll switch the channel to blue. I see this histogram. I'm just going to come down here till I see the background go away. And that corresponds to where this spike is in this histogram. Just come down to about there. Then I'm just going to add some thresholding, just a little softness, not to where I get into seeing the background creep in, but by adjusting these a little bit. That looks good. I don't need to be looking just at the blue channel. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit because we don't need to see it at 800%. Let's see how it looks. There is a small amount of noise, but I think once we're back at 100%, let's hide those masks. That is something that nobody's ever going to notice.
So these hands, he's talking with his hands. So even though they're over at the side of the frame, the fact that he's talking with his hands means we're watching them. And so it's kind of a worst case scenario because they're hard to do. They're not really prominent in frame, but they're important because we're looking at them. Wouldn't matter if the hands were way over here. Where is your eye going? It's watching the damn hands. So they've got to be extracted perfectly. This is just a case where inadvertently this thing, when they shot it, was probably just a little bit of extra business, has become the star of the shot, and we're gonna have to worry about it.
So just to gauge the difficulty, I did a bit of animated roto with masks on these, and it became apparent that there would need to be a good deal of breakdown. If you look at the shot on the whole, the hands don't in any way hold their position relative to camera. They turn over, they're sort of dancing from one to the other, and we would have to get down to really finely articulated roto, which is something we're going to get into in the next lesson. Not to mention the fact that they are a supporting element in this shot. And because the thing we're really looking at are those slot machines, I wanted a way where I could just get these hands good enough. Now, it did remind me a little bit of what happened with the hair in the other shot. So I thought I would try RotoBrush.
So I said a second ago that sometimes you just have to bite the bullet because an element has to be right. But I just am not at the point where I want to roto these hands. So I'm going to have to find something else.
Now, I thought that RotoBrush would be a good choice here because the problem of these fingers is a lot like the problem of the wispy hair. And I started by just masking off just the area that was needed, which is pretty minor. Then in the RotoBrush layer, I got into making some spans. So I'll unfreeze this and show you that I created my base frames right where there were the equivalent of what in animation you would call keyframes. So if I turn off rendering for a second, let's just look at those frames. So there's one where he holds the hands there. There's another position of the hands. That's the next one. And then finally this one. So that seemed like the right approach. And nevertheless, what ended up happening to make this work is, I'll show you, I had to use a lot of strokes. So this is like a piano roll of strokes that you see here. Now, these get created pretty quickly, but the overall process of back and forth, if I showed it to you in real time, was going to take, the better part of an hour.
So I'm going to offer a quick rule of thumb with RotoBrush, and let's call it the 20-minute rule. When you start on a RotoBrush, like any given set of strokes that you're extending out, spend only 20 minutes refining that before you evaluate whether to move forward or not. And if it's not coming together and new complications are still coming up, I would bail and look for a different approach, because it has happened to me and probably anyone who's tried to take RotoBrush to kind of its limit. The more you put in, the less you get out of it. And so that's kind of my rule of thumb for where you should be 80 to 90+% there, 20 minutes.
So at regular scale, this is the result. Those little bits you see flashing on and off at the side actually overlap outside of where the slot machine was. So I don't have to worry about those. But if you zoom in, it's not that great. Might be good enough, but not that great. And this was the result of carefully adding and subtracting selections the same way we did with the hair. So the lesson here is that if you're trying to use RotoBrush for something and you start to find that it's turning into a lot of manual work, that's usually a signal it's time to try a different solution. Now, just like with the plant leaves where I noticed how green they were compared to everything else, these hands look really red compared to everything else around them in the scene. But if I look at the red channel, their grayscale level isn't really that distinct from everything around them. It's kind of the same story in green and blue. So even though it looks red, if I choose the red channel in the extract effect and try to remove the background that way, I don't go too far before it starts to break. And I've still got a lot I haven't taken care of.
So right now, I'm feeling a little stumped. I really don't want this lesson to be about roto, just because of these damn hands. But so far, my efforts to extract them aren't working. So I think what I have to do is just kind of walk away, take a break, let it kind of simmer on the back burner and see if I come up with anything.
This is the result of using key light to solve my problem with the hands. Zoom in there for a second to get a better look at that.
Okay, I could spend a full hour describing the process. Well, maybe not an hour, but we could get into how this keying effect that's actually to remove things was turned around to just hold out the hands. I think you probably get the basic idea, but let me give you an overview and we'll just tab this one until we get more into key light.
So the layers soloed, allow me to quickly take you through what actually worked here. And like I said, I promise to go into more detail on this later on. Now, the key observation turned out to be that his hands just look very red compared to anything else in the scene, as does his face. Not red in a way where we could go to the red channel and extract them. Here they kind of look middle gray compared to the whites in the background and so on. But red in the way that Keylight understands them, which is that there is predominantly actual red in the image, if that makes sense. So just like the sweater's blue and the plant is green, the hands are actually red. And that's the way Keylight looks at the world, red, green, or blue. It's very rare that you end up keying red, because usually you're trying to preserve skin tones rather than get rid of them. But that's exactly what we did. So that was the first step. Then I added a choke and spread of that matte to just clean it up really quickly. I'll show you how to do that later. Shifted these so they would be an alpha channel with white as the core, and added a bit of blur to just feather that mask, which you can do with a black and white image. So having done that, I didn't have to worry about this extraneous detail because I'm using this mask on the main layer. And so by applying all that as a track matte layer, good to go.
So this kind of reminds me of how when I first wrote my books, some people at Adobe were really happy, never told this story, that I told the truth about things that didn't work straightforwardly in After Effects, where I was actually using a workaround or I was not using the tool as intended. This isn't quite exactly that, but this is an example of me not making textbook use of the tools. And frankly, I'm all for it. And I know you're with me, because if a visual effects artist can be all for non-standard use of the tools, then certainly a motion designer can be, right?
We know. You'd rather be in Vegas.
Pretty cool. Now, you may have noticed a couple extra additions in here, which are these head moves and repos of these shots. So if you remember, the wide shots were framed more like this, which I said was too high, and I didn't believe it was her point of view. I left this shot that way with the slot machines because they're so tall. I didn't want to cut them off, but that could be addressed later. Over here though, I've scaled the shot up slightly. However, since it was taken at 4K, I have plenty of room to do that. I'm only at 57% scale, and 50% would be filling the frame. So I've just added basically a head drift and snap over to the right to match her head move there, where she has her yawn, to subconsciously suggest that that's her point of view. And then we solidify that here where she snaps her head back, a little overshoot, and sets it up for that reaction. So we've done quite a lot of good work here. We've got a couple of elements integrated into this shot, including such extras as reflections and grain. And then over here, we've got more of that with a bit of extra tricky roto that had to be accomplished to pull this shot off. And then finally, this matching masterpiece here at the end. Now, all of this is just version 1. So, of course, it's going to depend on what it looks like once it's reviewed and, the client, whoever else wants to come back. All in all, I'm pretty psyched with how that came out.
All right, well, celebration time. We made it through our first lesson. Let's recap what all we got into here. So, color matching for the colorblind is a technique that I hope you make excellent use of. If you are one of the true natural pros who doesn't need it, great. But honestly, I think anyone will get faster and more accurate work, like 80-20, 80% there, and then you just finish it using this technique. We also got into matching, and that included matching some things that you might not normally think about. So matching shadows and reflections, that might be plainly obvious to the eye that your shot needs that. But I have to admit, I was working on my first feature before I knew anything about grain matching. And now, when I see shots that don't have it, it makes me crazy. Or even if it's not right, it's not right. So now you won't stop noticing it, probably, and you're welcome for that. Finally, roto brush, which is not technically part of this lesson, but I'm really happy that we had such a good use here for it. I don't know if your exercise is going to make quite as good use of this, but you will come up into situations where hair in particular or other fine detail benefits from whipping out the old roto brush. So I think this was great. And now let's see what you can do.